Welcome to Raul Effect, where we uncover the hidden psychology behind avoidant attachment, emotional patterns, and human behavior. If you're ready to understand what really happens beneath emotional distance and discover the truths most people never notice, you're in the right place. What if the biggest shock for an avoidant isn't losing someone, but realizing that the person they underestimated understood them all along? What if every moment of silence, every emotional withdrawal, and every mixed signal was quietly being observed instead of ignored? Stay with me, because this perspective may completely change the way you understand avoidant attachment and emotional intelligence. One of the most difficult moments for an avoidant isn't simply fearing that someone will leave. It's realizing the person they kept at arm's length understood the relationship far better than they ever imagined. That person wasn't naive or emotionally unaware. They were quietly paying attention, allowing time to reveal the full pattern before deciding whether the relationship was worth continuing. Many avoidant people believe their emotional defenses are difficult to recognize. They assume their distancing, inconsistency, and emotional withdrawal are subtle enough to go unnoticed. If someone remains patient, they often conclude that person doesn't truly understand what's happening. Patience gets mistaken for ignorance. Kindness is seen as weakness. Understanding is confused with emotional dependence. Because of this belief, they convince themselves that their hot and cold behavior stays hidden. Pulling away after moments of closeness, delayed replies, emotional shutdowns, disappearing and returning with affection, these cycles seem, in their mind, confusing enough to keep the other person uncertain. That illusion creates a false sense of security. They believe they control the pace of the relationship, stepping in and out emotionally without ever being fully understood. Eventually, though, that illusion falls apart. What unsettles the avoidant isn't discovering that their partner noticed a few isolated moments. It's realizing the other person recognized the entire pattern from the very beginning. Every emotional retreat, every inconsistency, every wall built in the name of independence was seen. While the avoidant believed they were protecting themselves, their partner was quietly connecting the dots. That realization can be deeply unsettling because it destroys the story they had been telling themselves. Their silence was never mysterious. Their emotional distance wasn't invisible. Their mixed signals were easier to recognize than they believed. Even the fear hidden beneath their detachment became clear to someone who was paying close attention. Slowly, the avoidant begins to understand something uncomfortable. Their partner's calm wasn't confusion. It was awareness. Their patience wasn't weakness. It was emotional maturity. Their silence wasn't blindness. It was observation. The person they underestimated had been watching carefully the entire time. This creates a level of emotional exposure that many avoidant people find extremely difficult to handle. They spend years building emotional walls, carefully managing vulnerability and controlling closeness. As long as the other person keeps chasing, those defenses feel effective. But once they realize the other person understood the pattern all along, those defenses stop feeling protective. Instead, they begin to feel exposed. What makes it even harder is realizing their partner remembered everything. Every disappearance after intimacy, every broken promise, every sudden shift in behavior, every request for space that masked emotional withdrawal. None of it was forgotten. Those moments became part of a much larger picture. For someone accustomed to creating distance instead of facing accountability, this realization can be overwhelming. Old conversations begin to take on new meaning. Moments they dismissed now look completely different. They recognize that when their partner stayed calm instead of reacting emotionally, it wasn't because they were lost or confused. They were simply gathering clarity. That clarity forces the avoidant to face something they have spent years trying to avoid: accountability. Once someone fully understands the cycle, the usual patterns lose their power. Silence no longer creates uncertainty. Distance no longer creates control. Mixed signals no longer keep someone emotionally attached. You cannot manipulate a dynamic that has already been understood. This is often the point where genuine fear of loss finally appears. Not because the partner suddenly changed, but because they stopped participating in the cycle. Avoidant individuals often expect people to chase after emotional distance. They unconsciously believe their withdrawal will pull someone closer. But emotionally aware partners eventually become exhausted. They stop explaining themselves. They stop pursuing consistency from someone unwilling to provide it. They stop trying to fix what only the other person can address. When that happens, the avoidant is left alone with the consequences of their own behavior. For the first time, they begin seeing the relationship through their partner's perspective. They realize the patience wasn't endless tolerance. It was someone carefully observing actions instead of words, waiting to see whether the inconsistency was temporary or reflected a deeper emotional pattern. That level of restraint requires real emotional strength. Once the avoidant recognizes it, they can no longer dismiss the person they once underestimated. Emotionally intelligent people don't always react immediately. Often, they observe first. They stay quiet while collecting information. They allow repeated behavior to reveal the truth before making important decisions. By the time they emotionally detach, they've usually reached complete clarity about why. At that point, everything changes. The avoidant realizes their partner is no longer trapped in confusion. They understand the cycle. They can often predict the next withdrawal before it even happens. The avoidant's sense of control begins to disappear, replaced by feelings of regret, vulnerability, guilt, and discomfort. Even if those emotions are never spoken out loud, they are often deeply felt. Their emotional defenses no longer provide the protection they once did because the truth has already been seen. Once someone fully understands the pattern, the relationship can never return to the illusion that existed before. That is when many avoidant people face one of the hardest truths of all. The person they underestimated was never blind. They were simply patient enough to let the truth reveal itself over time. And in that moment, the avoidant may finally recognize something they spent years trying not to face. The most emotionally exposed person in the relationship was never the one who stayed. It was the one hiding behind emotional distance all along. For many avoidant people, this realization becomes far more life-changing than they ever admit. For some, it's the first step toward genuine self-awareness. They begin to recognize that it wasn't love that threatened the relationship, it was their own fear of closeness. Looking back, they see how often they created distance at the exact moments when someone was trying to build trust and emotional security. The person they questioned wasn't the real danger. Their own protective patterns were. Not every avoidant responds this way, though. Some find this truth too painful to face. Instead of reflecting, they retreat even further behind emotional walls because admitting their role in the relationship feels overwhelming. Accountability becomes something they instinctively avoid. But no matter how they respond, one fact never changes. Their partner saw the entire picture. Every inconsistency, every withdrawal, every sudden coldness, every disappearance disguised as independence. It was all noticed long before the avoidant recognized it themselves. Even more difficult is realizing that the other person stayed long enough to understand the full pattern before making a final decision. What avoidants rarely expect is how deeply it affects them when that person quietly lets go for good. That's when everything begins to shift internally. Losing someone who truly understood them hurts in a different way. It's not only the loss of the relationship, it becomes a confrontation with themselves. That awareness doesn't disappear overnight. In quiet moments, old conversations return. Situations they once dismissed suddenly carry new meaning. They begin replaying memories from their partner's perspective and realize that what looked like acceptance was actually careful observation. Their partner wasn't emotionally unaware. They were patiently deciding whether the relationship offered enough stability, consistency, and emotional safety to continue investing in. Every repeated behavior became another piece of a much larger picture. What appeared to be endless patience was actually thoughtful evaluation. Gradually, the avoidant realizes they were never as unreadable as they believed. They weren't hiding their fears as successfully as they imagined. Every emotional shutdown, every withdrawal, every cycle of closeness followed by distance quietly revealed the truth. Emotionally healthy people don't always leave after the first disappointment. Many stay long enough to determine whether the behavior is temporary or part of a lasting pattern. They silently ask themselves difficult questions. Can this person stay emotionally present when intimacy grows? Can they build consistency instead of uncertainty? Is this relationship becoming healthier, or is the same cycle repeating itself? Most avoidants don't recognize those silent questions until the answers have already been reached. Everything changes when their partner stops chasing. The long explanations disappear. The effort to repair every distance fades away. Emotional energy shifts from pursuing connection to peacefully letting go. That's when the avoidant discovers something they never expected. Someone who truly values themselves has patience, but that patience is not endless. Their partner wasn't waiting out of helplessness. They were carefully watching reality unfold. Every broken promise, every mixed signal, every emotional retreat became part of the decision they were quietly making. This realization challenges everything the avoidant believed about themselves. They thought emotional distance kept them hidden. Instead, their actions revealed everything. Silence never erased the pattern. Distance never erased the inconsistency. Calmness never meant confusion. Their partner wasn't staying because they depended on the relationship. They stayed because they wanted to know whether it could become emotionally safe enough to build a future. In the end, they weren't asking for perfection. They were hoping for consistency, accountability, and emotional responsibility. Instead, they experienced repeated cycles of closeness followed by withdrawal, warmth followed by emotional absence. What the avoidant viewed as subtle self-protection became clear evidence that something deeper wasn't changing. Before long, the weight of carrying all that uncertainty becomes impossible to ignore. Eventually, the avoidant is confronted with one of the most difficult truths they will ever face. The distance they relied on to feel safe slowly became the very thing that pushed the relationship apart. The silence they believed gave them control gradually created emotional separation. Those protective walls didn't just keep pain out, they also prevented real love from getting in. One of the hardest discoveries comes when they realize the person they once viewed as emotionally needy was actually the stronger one. Strong enough to love deeply without sacrificing self-respect. Strong enough to recognize unhealthy patterns without turning every moment into an argument. Strong enough to leave when it became clear that their emotional needs would never be met consistently. That realization changes everything. What once looked like strength through emotional detachment begins to feel very different. Watching someone walk away calmly, without anger or chaos, reveals a kind of strength the avoidant never fully understood. Real strength isn't creating distance, it's knowing when to accept reality. The quiet at the end isn't uncertainty, it's closure. Walking away isn't surrender, it's an act of self-respect. And leaving isn't about giving up on love, it's about refusing to ignore the truth any longer. For many avoidants, this understanding arrives only after the relationship is already over. Once their partner recognizes that nothing meaningful is changing, they stop chasing, stop explaining, and stop hoping that tomorrow will be different. They simply choose to move forward. The lesson that lingers is often this. The person they underestimated saw far more than they realized. Their patience wasn't weakness, it was quiet wisdom. They stayed long enough to let consistent behavior reveal the truth for itself. Looking back, the avoidant begins connecting moments that once seemed insignificant. They finally understand that their partner's calmness was never desperation. It was emotional maturity. What they mistook for attachment was actually clarity. Their partner didn't stay because they couldn't leave. They stayed because they wanted to know whether the pattern would truly change or simply continue. That distinction makes all the difference. Little by little, the avoidant realizes that silence was never approval. It wasn't permission for inconsistency. It was space to observe. While they assumed everything was fine because no one was complaining, their partner was quietly paying attention, allowing actions to speak louder than words. What appeared to be dependence was actually discernment. What looked like endless tolerance was careful awareness. Even what seemed like vulnerability was, in reality, remarkable emotional discipline. This shift in perspective can be deeply painful because it changes the meaning of the entire relationship. Their partner wasn't confused or lost. They were quietly gathering enough evidence to understand whether lasting change was truly possible. Instead of reacting to every withdrawal or demanding constant reassurance, They watched to see if consistency would develop naturally. When it didn't, the answer became obvious without needing another conversation. That's when the truth begins to sink in. Every period of closeness followed by distance. Every emotional shutdown after intimacy. Every repeated inconsistency became another piece of a larger picture. Nothing was overlooked. Nothing was excused. It was simply observed. Once the pattern became undeniable, the decision no longer required conflict. It only required honesty. The avoidant also discovers that the control they believed they had was mostly an illusion. Pulling away never protected them the way they imagined. Instead, every withdrawal revealed the pattern more clearly to someone who was paying attention. While they were trapped inside their own habits, their partner was seeing the complete picture from the outside. Perhaps the most humbling realization is understanding that their partner wasn't holding on because of endless hope. They were comparing potential with reality. As reality continued repeating the same cycle, possibility slowly lost its value. Eventually, leaving wasn't an emotional reaction. It became the natural conclusion supported by repeated experience. That's why the ending often feels so absolute. It wasn't caused by one dramatic fight or one unforgettable mistake. It happened because clarity finally outweighed uncertainty. Once someone reaches that level of understanding, staying no longer feels healthy. In the end, healthy love teaches a simple but powerful lesson. Love isn't measured by how much pain someone can endure. It's measured by whether both people consistently create emotional safety, reliability, and trust. When those qualities disappear again and again, even the most patient person eventually chooses peace over possibility. Once that decision is made with complete clarity, there is nothing left to debate. Only the quiet certainty of an ending that was understood long before it finally arrived. Real emotional strength isn't found in creating distance or avoiding vulnerability. It's found in honesty, consistency, and the courage to build trust. The people who truly understand your patterns don't always react immediately. Sometimes they simply observe until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. If this video gave you a new perspective on avoidant attachment and relationships, be sure to like, subscribe, and see Raul Effect for more powerful insights into human psychology and emotional growth.